All right, this is the Racial Equity and Policing Commission Policy and Practice Subcommittee. Thursday, November 12th, 4 p.m. This meeting will be an electronic meeting pursuant to the Core Commission determination that conducting the meeting at a physical location presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present at the anchor location. The subcommittee meeting will not have a physical location and all attendees will connect remotely. The meeting is on Zoom, and more information about the meeting can be found at the Salt Lake City website, slc.gov/boards/racial-equity-in-policing-commission/. I'm Josh King. I am a facilitator for the commission, and welcome everybody to the subcommittee meeting today, which will run approximately 1 hour. I'll do my best to keep us to that hour to end at 5 o'clock. This is the, I lose track, third subcommittee meeting, and we have identified scope of items to look at and look into. And today our focus will be on use of force, policy 300, and personnel practices and accountability in Salt Lake City PD law enforcement. And last subcommittee meeting, we had a good discussion, and from what I heard, it was very educational and helpful as this subcommittee looks to understand and learn and be educated to make informed decisions and recommendations. The minutes were sent to the group. They don't need any kind of formal approval, just for reference. And so I want to make quick introductions just so we know who's on, and then just a couple updates on schedule, and we'll jump right into use of force policy 300, take advantage of the time that we have the police department here and the chief with us. So I'm just going to do a quick round robin, just name and your role, because we have some guests on today, and then we'll get into it. And so on my screen, I'm seeing Stephen Johnson with, I tend to be informal and mean no disrespect. I know we had this discussion last time. Commissioner Johnson, start with you, and then Commissioner Shiflett next.
Yes, I'm Steve Johnson. I'm the chair of the Utah Black Chamber of Commerce. I'm also on the direct board of the Good Deed Law Project for debt reform. And I'm with the office of Luke Johnson and Lewis in my private life.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Shiflett with Lamar next.
I am Carol Shiflett, Commissioner Shiflett, I'm sorry. The owner of the Sojourner Group that supports Black women who've been victimized by sexual assault and domestic violence. And I'm on the board of the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault. That's enough for now.
Thank you, Commissioner. All right, Lamar.
Yep. Lamar Ewell, Salt Lake City Police Department. I'm Deputy Chief to Chief Brown, and I oversee the Administrative Bureau.
All right, thank you. We appreciate you being on with us today. All right, Scott, more Gus.
Yeah, Scott Morkus. I'm captain over the training division for the Salt Lake City Police Department.
All right, thank you. I'll just call you Captain.
You can call me Scott if you'd like. That'd be fine.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Darlene, we're doing brief introductions. We have some guests on today, and then we'll jump right into it. So I'm just going around my screen, and Chief is next, and then I'll ask you a brief introduction, Commissioner McDonald.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chief Mike Brown. It's good to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Commissioner McDonald.
Hi, I'm Commissioner McDonald. I am the current chair of the Utah Black Roundtable, and among other things, but that's good for now.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Kira, and then Mark and Rachel.
I'm Kira Luke, and I'm Salt Lake City Council staff.
Thank you, Kira. Mark?
Oh, sorry. Thanks, commissioners, for having me again. Mark Cottrell, Salt Lake City Attorney's Office. And hopefully I can be of assistance again this week.
All right, thank you, Mark. Rachel, and then Yvette, and then Luna.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Otto, Mayor Mendenhall's Chief of Staff. Thanks for letting me listen in today.
Thanks for joining us, Rachel. All right, my screen's moving around here, so I'm trying to capture everybody. Commissioner Commissioner Luna.
Hi, my name is Luna. As mentioned, I'm one of the commission members. Is that enough? Because I don't know what I was supposed to do. Okay.
All right. Commissioner Ephraim.
Hi everyone, my name is Ephraim Coombe. Do I need much more of an introduction than that?
Nope, we're good. We're short on
All
time.
right.
Well, that's good. And then recognize Andrew Riggle on joining us as well. And I think Andrew, want to recognize you. Thanks for spending time with us again.
Appreciate the opportunity as always.
All right. So again, we have until 5 o'clock and had a productive call meeting last week, and the subcommittee identified 2 areas: use of force, policy section 300, and then personnel hiring, firing. And so the purpose of inviting the guests onto the call today and their attendance is to provide some background information and answer questions. And so I want to take advantage of that time and turn it over to our guests, the Salt Lake City Police Department. I know last time there were some questions around the executive order and how that modified section 3, policy 300, and how that's been implemented and how it's going. So Chief, could you educate us on that, provide some overview, and allow commission members to ask any questions?
There we go. Thanks, Josh. I was going to, let me just give a kind of a brief introduction, and then I'm going to turn the time over to Scott Morkos, Captain Morkos, and he's going to talk a little bit more in depth about the actual policies and the training associated with those. But we received, I mean, 2020 has been quite a year with everything that we've all gone through, but following the very unfortunate incident in Minneapolis with the death of Mr. George Floyd, there was a lot of outcry in this country, and it wasn't just here in Salt Lake, it was across the country. And there was, the voices spoke very loud that they wanted police reform. They wanted to talk about use of force and the things that that were occurring across this country. And so kind of on the heels of that, not really the heels, but in the heat of that discussion, Mayor Mendenhall gave us an executive order. And within that order, there were certain things that she felt, and I agree, we needed to address to look at the use of force that we use within a police department, to be accountable for it, and to be able to look at ways that we can change that use of force and reform to meet the expectations of the community. And so we brought together, it seemed like the entire police department, but we brought together probably 42 individuals to talk about these issues and concerns within the police department, to draft policies that met that executive order and that we could put forth. And that happened, I think, August 3rd, I believe, was the date of the executive order. Hang on, I'm looking right now. Rachel, is that correct, or Mark?
Yep, that is correct, Chief. That's what my copy is stamped as the city recorder.
So we worked diligently and with the officers within this department and went through each of the policies that were expected to be addressed by the executive order. And I think we brought forward very good policies that reflect the changes that the mayor wanted to see, but really that hopefully met the changes that the community wanted to see. So with that being said, the policies were put into effect, and it's been Captain Morkos's job, and his job is kind of new. Within the training division, we've never had a captain specifically assigned to training. But if you're going to expect change and reform, you're going to have to train to it, and then you're going to have to hold people accountable to it. And so it's been Captain Morkos's job, and he's done a fantastic job to outline these changes and give us direction and help us train our department to meet these expectations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Captain Morkos to kind of walk through these different policies.
Thank you, Chief. I'm sure it was a long and engaged process and a lot of discussion, and probably hard to summarize it in 2 minutes, but we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, I have to apologize. I didn't know that I was going to be speaking on policy today. I thought I was just coming along for the ride to talk about training issues. So is there anything specific anybody would like to know about the use of force policy? I think that might be a better way to kind of start delving into it rather than me just reading down a long policy. Is there something specific anybody has questions about it that we can talk about?
Well, let me ask Scott, just on the heels of what the chief said, and then the commission members can add to this. From what I heard last meeting, they were interested in the executive order, and then Mr. Cottrell shared with us the revised policy that came out from that order, the work that Chief Brown just mentioned. So there was an interest from the subcommittee on implementation of that. And I know it's been a short time, but how has it been trained and how has it been implemented and what are you seeing? So that's the broad, I think, interest of the group, what they'd like to hear, but I'll let the commission speak for themselves. Commissioner Shiflett.
You know I'm going to have something to say, right? The issue that bothered me last week was that first purpose and scope. And the words, the police requires that only the amount of force that is reasonably appears necessary, given the facts and circumstances perceived by the officer at the time, at the time may be used. And that was extremely troublesome to a couple of us, because reasonably appears necessary and circumstances perceived by the officer at that time. That's a little scary. And a couple of the other commissioners spoke up. If you don't mind me calling you out, Mr. Johnson, could you share how you agreed with me last week and why, as a Black man sitting on this call? And I think Commissioner Coombe as well, but go ahead.
Yeah, Commissioner Coombe broke it down actually directly. I agree with the broadness of the language. Reasonable. There's the way that statement, the first part of that reads, it's just so broad and it's just a large range where, I don't see much accountability in that first statement.
So Scott, to give you some background, Mr. Cottrell gave us subcommittee an overview of Graham v. Connor and Fourth Amendment and discussed the policy somewhat. So I think be helpful to understand the concerns that were just brought up and how that is actually applied, or you train on that.
Sure. So let me say a couple of things, and then maybe that'll answer some of your questions. If not, please let me know and we can talk more about it. So when we're talking about appears reasonably necessary, one of the examples that I can often give people, individuals, to kind of start talking about that and having that discussion is let's take, for example, somebody shows up at a call where let me start off by saying, first, we have to recognize again that we are dealing with individuals, police officers, who are working in situations who have imperfect information, right? When they show up on a scene, all they have is what was given to them in a dispatch call, as well as what they're observing as they get there. They have imperfect information about what's actually going on. So let me give an example to that. An individual shows up, a police officer shows up to a scene where a man is holding a woman hostage, is holding a gun to her head. The officer, from seeing that, perceives that it's reasonably necessary to shoot that individual because he is holding a woman hostage with a gun to her head. Come to find out, after the investigation is completed, it was an airsoft gun, right? It wasn't a real gun. So if we're talking about the term necessary, factually, it wasn't necessary because he couldn't shoot that woman with an airsoft gun. But it was reasonable for him to believe it was necessary in that moment based on the imperfect information that he or she had available to them at that time. So while I understand why that might seem a little fuzzy as far as language goes, we have to remember that officers are often responding to situations might not be that dramatic, right? But I think it conveys the point that they have imperfect information. So we have to allow them to make reasonable inferences off of the information they have available to them and what they're perceiving in that moment, not what we find out 24 hours later.
All right, Commissioner Coombe.
I think that there's I think there's probably a lot that we, as well as like others in the community, could agree upon, and as far as that scenario is concerned. But I think also on the flip side, you have a situation where a mother is calling about her autistic son who's having a bit of a fit, and she's made the police know, like, aware about this disability. He's not armed. He does run away, and he gets shot several times in the back. And so, I mean, I think it's still a situation where there's not perfect information, but I think a lot of us would agree that that was not reasonable nor necessary. But I mean, personally, I'm not too sure what has transpired as far as that event goes, and where the policies come into play in that scenario. And I think maybe the concern we have is that both of those instances could be protected under the same policy.
Well, let me ask Scott about that, Ephraim, and then I see you, Commissioner Shiflett. I'll come to you. You're touching on the information that an officer has and reacting or acting based on that. And so what section of the policy or what speaks to that information gathering process and communication process prior to an officer being put in that situation where they make a decision?
So, I mean, let's be frank, like we all know the situation. Is it Mr. Coombe or Cum? I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry.
Cool.
Coombe. We all know the situation Mr. Coombe is talking about, right? You know, obviously I don't know all the details of that particular circumstance because the investigation isn't complete, right? So you might look at that scenario and have concerns about the reasonableness and necessariness of it. People within the department might have questions about the reasonableness and necessariness of it. The fact remains that it's still being investigated. So what happens for the internal investigation when it's looking at the policy, as well as the criminal investigation where the district attorney is looking at it, those are the determinations that have to be made, right? Does the district attorney determine that it was reasonably necessary for that officer to use force? And that's a legal question. Once that's determined, or at the same time, the department will have to look at it under the policy to determine, based on all of the circumstances that the officer had available, the knowledge the officer did and didn't have available to him at the time, was it reasonable to think that that was necessary? And again, I can't answer that question at this point because I don't have all that information. And nobody on this call has that information, so we have to wait and see how that plays out.
Okay, I think the question here right now is not about the specific case. If we take that case into hypothetical sort of analysis and say, if this had happened, could you refer and tell us what policies could be in play where this can be justified? Let's not look at the specifics. I think this is basically the disconnect between the community and the police force of saying, we keep hearing this rhetoric of saying, the investigation is going on or there are other stuff going on. But we as a committee would like more information as to how this is applied. So let's take this case out and let's suppose this is an imaginary case and then analyze it.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead. Somebody was talking.
Yeah, sorry, Scott, Luna, Commissioner, that's a great question, and understanding what policies are in play in a situation like that. And Commissioner Shiflett, do you want to add to that? Or
I wanted to agree with Commissioner, how do you pronounce your name, Miss Luna? I agree because that word reasonable is really a big word. Reasonably appears, and you could take any case and say, well, to this officer, it appeared to be reasonable for him to use force in a particular case. Say the incident with the dog that bit the young man, but where did this I mean, when you look at reasonably appears necessary, that's a matter of perspective on the spot. And the officer may be in fear of his life and react. And so, I mean, my question is, what is being done for de-escalating law enforcement to talk the situation down instead of using reasonable force, if you know what I mean, if you understand what I'm saying.
There's a whole lot coming at me there at once. Yeah. So let me see.
I was about to step in and actually apologize. I think I went about it in a way that puts you into focus and everything, and that's not my intention. It is more as a department trying to understand in this space as to how we as community member can understand this better. And I wanted to shift the conversation from specific case to, looking at it, because as community member, we also know that there are many folks around us who are always reasonably doubtful, reasonably dangerous, reasonably threat, and all of that. And we have to have some kind of frank conversation, and we can't go back to, using policy or under investigation kind of labels. We have to kind of get through to the weeds and talk about this.
And that's why I mentioned the de-escalation, just because when you see that, I think we need to really start talking about that as well, but continue.
Okay, so let me see if I can address some of these, and then I'm sure I'm not going to hit some of them, so please raise them again if I don't. So let's start out with the reasonable part, right? So in the end, any evaluation of reasonableness, at least to some degree, is going to be subjective. Whether it's in a legal sense, a policy sense, or just an individual's personal take on something, right? There's just no way to get around that. That being said, under the case law, Graham v. Connor and all the other cases that have come after it that kind of reinforce Graham v. Connor, there are specific things that the law looks at to determine whether an officer's action was reasonable. It's a non-exhaustive list, right? So everything that's been in the case law previously if it's not in the case law previously, doesn't mean it's not going to be included in the future, and vice versa, right? But some of the things that we talk about and the law talks about is what was the nature of the offense, right? How serious was the offense that the individual was having force used on them for, right? That's one thing that's looked at. What were the actions of the individual, right? What were they doing in response or to the officer or somebody else at the time? What would an officer that has the same amount of training and presented with the same circumstances look at and do in a similar situation? There are all of these concepts that are brought in the legal sense of reasonableness that you have to take each individual circumstance and apply them to. Like I having worked in this field for 16 years, I don't see, and I am willing to accept that I might be wrong on this, but I don't see how we can have an across the board X equals Y or Y equals Z as far as this is reasonable, this is not reasonable. Every individual circumstance provides different nuance, different circumstances, different information that was or wasn't available to an officer in that moment. And each one has to be individually analyzed to determine if it was reasonable what he or she did or not. When it comes to de-escalation, there really is, it's a term I struggle with, not because I have a problem with de-escalation. De-escalation is something we train. It's a focus of the training division, but because it's very amorphous, right? What does de-escalation mean? What is included under de-escalation and what's not included under de-escalation? De-escalation obviously includes good communication skills, right? Trying to talk to somebody and calm the situation down. Obviously, that's a de-escalation skill. However, there are some circumstances where using force is de-escalation, right? If we show up to a Trolley Square shooting, using force de-escalates that situation. So again, it all depends on the circumstances that the officer is presented with in that moment. And I understand why individuals have concerns when looking at it in that way. But I think we have to remember that we're dealing with officers that are presented with novel situations in almost every circumstance, and what they're presented with, not presented with, what the interaction between them and the individual, how that goes, it's all different every single time, which is why each circumstance needs to be looked at individually.
So if I can, I see Commissioner Coombe and Chief Brown, and Chief, you might be answering this, speaking to this, but I was curious, if not related to your comment, if you could speak to the executive order and what was in place before and when some of these events took place, and we don't want to focus on specific events, but before, and what it looks like now related to this subject that we're talking about.
Yeah, Scott, let me jump in here just real quick and basically I mean, and I think, and Mark Cottrell, maybe you can jump in as well, but I think when we talk about reasonableness, we have to go back to the U.S. Supreme Court, the landmark case of 1989, the Graham versus Connor, that holds that the use of force is to be judged against a standard of objective reasonableness under the Fourth Amendment, which means in that moment in time, and I think that's what Captain Morcos is talking about, it must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. So that reasonableness, and Scott's talking about the different situations that officers are put in, but it's what the officer knew at that time on the scene that force had to be used. But I think the whole idea behind the executive order was, what if we had policies in place that we never had to get to those 3 or 4 seconds in time where an officer had to make those very difficult judgments and decisions to use force? I mean, it goes back to wearing our body-worn cameras. We talk about that and how appropriate it is to wear the camera, turn it on, have it on, and be able to show the transparency and the openness that the community wants. But it also talks about tactics to precede the use of force. What if there were things that we could do as a police department, that we didn't put ourselves in a situation where we had that confrontation? What if we could use time, distance? We had appropriate officers on scene, cover, concealment, all those things that we're taught in the academy to not put or kind of, if we could step back in time and not have to have that a dangerous encounter with somebody. What if we, and in the executive order it talks about that we must use de-escalation. If we can, we must use de-escalation. And that includes attempting verbal persuasion. I'm just reading out of the policy right now, but it talks about attempting verbal persuasion, establish rapport, increasing distance and time, finding, using, maintaining available cover, performing a threat assessment, denying access to barricaded and tactically superior positions, summoning additional resources, have a plan, providing accurate communications with responding personnel. These are the things that we list out in policy as the things that an officer should consider when we get into a situation like this.
That, Chief, what section is that? And were those additions in this recent modification after the executive order, or?
Yeah, Josh, I'd have to go back and look at before and after, but I do know that the de-escalation, it comes down to, it says, when circumstances reasonably permit, officers must use strategies and techniques to decrease, intensify the intensity of a situation, improve decision-making, improve communication, reduce the level of force needed, and increase voluntary compliance. So yeah, that is a lot stronger verbiage pertaining to and relating to the executive order. Some of the other things that we put in there is shooting from a moving vehicle or at a moving vehicle. Those are very dangerous situations, and there's policies that address that. There's another one that talks about duty to intercede. If you see somebody doing something that they shouldn't be doing, I mean, we're all human. Many times officers, just like everybody else, have a bad day. If somebody is going to an unreasonable amount of force, and we have the ability to step in and to stop that, it's in policy that we will do that. We talk about no deadly force and self-harm. What if somebody calls us, and I think you've heard of it, talked about, it's suicide by cop. What if we responded differently? What if we took the time to maybe make the phone call, or to find perhaps a different way to intercede rather than bring deadly force to a situation where an individual wants it? And so these are all policies that were kind of addressed in this executive order to help us think outside the box, so that we don't ever have to get into that moment in time where we may have to use deadly force. And that I think is the strength of the executive order and what we've tried to accomplish in this policy. So with that, I'll kind of kick it back to you, Mark Cottrell or Scott Morco.
All right, thank you, Chief. That's good clarification on some changes, and want to give time to Commissioner Coombe, who's had his hand up for about 8 minutes, and then Commissioner Shiflett.
I mean, Mark went over Graham v. Connor with us last week, and so like we're aware of like what's there, and I know that within that, as well as in the use of force policy, there's this notion of objectively reasonable force, and that it doesn't take into consideration hindsight, nor does it take into consideration intent or things like that, or at least from what I've read. And like I know that the executive order exists, and there's like good things in there. You know, having a duty to intercede is like important, but it's still based upon this view of reasonableness, and I don't know. I don't know if it's ever objective. So like there's like always a concern with that in the case law as well as in the policy. But
Well,
even like in even in like a situation like with duty to intercede, it's based off if the other officer finds the action unreasonable. So if it's a situation where they both agree on the reasonableness of it, then you know you could still have a bad situation, like with the scenario that I had referenced prior. And so I think we can like appreciate the importance of subjective reactions and, you know, having to make decisions like in real time. I think what we just are wanting to do is make it such that there's not such a disconnect between what an officer or a department thinks is reasonable versus what a community thinks is reasonable. Because I think that's all. I think it like if the community thought it was okay for that kid to be shot in the back several times, there'd be less of a need for this conversation, I think. But we didn't find that to be okay. And so, you know, and I know that's a specific case that's still being investigated, but in other instances where the community felt that the action was not reasonable, but a policy justified it, or Graham v. Connor justified it, that's ultimately the issue we're trying to address, is how do we make case law and policy not be so disconnected from the community? Because at the end of the day, it's about the community.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Kuhn. And so I think that goes to our objective of understanding and application of the policy, right? And reconciling reasonably necessary to a police officer and law enforcement, and what a citizen might believe is reasonably necessary. And dialogue like this helps understand that. And I know we can't talk about specific cases, but scenarios, and Chief talked a lot about de-escalation and some measurements that can be implemented to where reasonably necessary doesn't even need to come in to the picture. But Commissioner Shiflett, you had your hand up.
I just wanted, first I wanted to say, I'm not trying to put you on the defensive, so I apologize if it's coming at you that way. And for me, you know, I heard the word concern, and I thought, you know, it's a matter of fear for me, knowing that I have two sons, knowing that I see these Black men on this phone call. For me, it's a matter, you know, you look at that sentence and my antennas just immediately go up with fear. So as opposed to being a matter of a concern, I think it's just the fear of seeing that language and knowing, seeing so much with so many Black men being killed and Black women as well. So I don't mean to put you on the defensive. I just wanted to be clear that maybe I'm just getting too emotional and I'm not sure about the men on the call, but it's the fear of that language. There's fear in that language for me.
All right. Commissioner Andrew Weirden, did I say that right, Steve?
Perfectly, thank you.
In
No,
practice.
I'm not a formal member of this committee, but because it didn't conflict with other committees, I wanted to jump in, and very impressed with the conversation so far, personally. But I did just want to throw a few things out from my perspective as retired law enforcement and member of this commission, looking for positive change through our recommendations, and believing that law enforcement really does a good job, but knowing that we can also do better, right? So any institution that stops evaluating their effectiveness starts to backslide, right? So we should constantly be pressing that envelope. So one thing, just briefly on the intercede, part of deconfliction training is working to reduce the conflict with a subject and an officer, but it's also an officer understanding that their partner might be overreacting, or they may be triggered and they may not be responding appropriately, right? So I feel like, and to you, Captain Morto, I'm sorry, probably said it wrong, Scott. Part of my cat's tearing up the back. I'm so sorry. Part of that de-escalation needs to involve that officer to enforce that policy, right? So, Commissioner Coombe, you beautifully articulated what the expectation of the community is, and I invited the police department in our meeting on Tuesday to dig a little deeper into that community conversation to hear what you all are saying and thinking, particularly as members of communities of color, and I totally agree with that. But I do want to say that the executive order is now policy. It's controversial in law enforcement because the mayor took the initiative to raise the floor on several issues that go above and beyond what is required by the law, right? So one example of that is in use of force. It's about the imminence of protecting a third party. And there are folks out there who are pushing back against Salt Lake PD for doing that. And I personally think it's a good thing. I think they're responsible policies, but that is the start of what can be more policies that are directed by that community conversation to that higher standard, and then can be implemented and trained. And of course, it takes a while for that culture to bite, to take effect. But it's important that it's that process that was just articulated has already started by that executive order. And I don't think it should end there, but I do think it should be acknowledged. And then the final thought while I have the floor is, having been a police officer for 25 years, some of it on the road, some of it doing more intense assignment like gang enforcement, some of it being a training commander, being a chief, precinct chief, where I did review uses of force and have that higher responsibility. A lot in law enforcement is taking a concept like reasonable and necessary, or probable cause, or exigency, and trying to apply it to a set of circumstances. And developing policy is so difficult because we can't account for everything that might happen out in the community, right? And I've personally seen some things that if somebody wrote that down, I wouldn't believe it in a Hollywood script, but yet I was living it in that moment and trying to apply a policy to that, right? So I think that it's important for all the commissioners to know that this is what law enforcement does, every day, not always well, but every day. And often those checks in that, the accountability in that, is the courts, whether it's criminal court, or it's the DA's office, or it's civil liability, or it's policy investigation by the department, where sometimes that's criminal, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's disciplinary action. But there are several layers of that will manage those evaluations, right? And for me, this policy committee is particularly important because there are so many different layers that manage and regulate the behavior of law enforcement. And most of those are out of the control of Salt Lake City, right? Like the state laws, the Constitution, the district attorney's office, which is a county level elected. And the use of policy to regulate and hold officers accountable through that internal investigation. And if we haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend we have a great conversation with the Internal Affairs Division on how they conduct their work. Because if there's a policy violation on that executive order that is a higher level than what the law is, the law will probably say what you did is okay. And the department can say maybe legal, but it's outside of policy, and there will be accountability here up to and including termination, right? So I just kind of wanted to try to weave all of that together, at least from my perspective, trying to see all the perspectives of the board and also coming from that law enforcement background. So thanks for letting me sit in on your commission.
Thanks, Commissioner Andrew Weirden. Appreciate that and your insights. What I'd like to do is Commissioner Coombe had a question, and then Chief, I see you're on the screen. Let you respond, and then I'd like 10 minutes to let, since we invited the police department to talk about personnel, just to give us an overview, 10 minutes, and then I'd ask commission members if we could stay on an additional 10 minutes to debrief what we heard. Do I have that permission to do that? Are you guys okay with that? Okay. All right. Commissioner Coombe and then Chief, you can just transition that to the personnel questions that we had outlined for you. All right, Commissioner Coombe.
Truthfully, I just needed to let you all know that I have to get going to another meeting right now. But I just wanted to say thank you to Steve, Scott, and Chief Brown, as well as the commissioners for the conversation today. But I would have said this in the chat, but the chat's disabled, so I couldn't quite say it. But hopefully I can watch the recording later. But thank you all.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, Chief Brown.
And I just going to say, Commissioner Coombe, he's probably gone, but I appreciate him. Even in his young age, he's wise beyond years, and he asks very hard questions. And Commissioner Shiflett, I appreciate your perspective as well, and Steve, yours too. What I wanted to say is, with that executive order, we did try to go above and beyond the foundation of Graham versus Connor, and to bring into play policies that would help officers hopefully never be in that situation where they have to use force or deadly force. I mean, policies, we've written good policies, and policies are just ink on paper unless you train to them. And that's the goal of Captain Scott Morcos, to take these policies from paper, to implement these into the practice that we use on the street. And when you say reasonableness, that's where we want to train above and beyond through in-service training. Scott's had some great ideas about doing some adult learning scenario training where we do it more than just 3 or 4 times a year. We do it constantly so that it becomes part of our DNA, our culture. And that's how we really want to take these policies to the next level and be the police department that I think you want. And what I really appreciate is just the ability to have these conversations and to listen to your feedback, because it's very good. And it doesn't fall on deaf ears. We're trying very hard as a police department to do those things. And that's what Captain Morcos, he's been given a daunting task, but I know he's up for the work that needs to be done. So thank you, commissioners. With that, if there's any questions for me, please let me know. If not, I'd like to introduce Christy Judd. She is the director over our public relations, and she does a lot of our communications. She kind of heads up our outreach and recruitment. So Christy, with that, we'll turn, unless somebody, do you have any questions for me, commissioners, right now?
We might later, Chief, but I think you gave us a lot to think about and directed us, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. With that, Christy, we'll turn the time over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for having me. I had the questions that you sent over regarding recruitment of police officers. So I just wanted to say that our recruiting we don't have a designated like full-time recruiting staff. So we rely on some members of my team and then some augmented members who are just, regular detectives or patrol officers who fill in for the various recruiting events that we go to. We recruit across the state. We open it up to out of state also. And we just kind of overcame one of the big hurdles of that with an NPOST test going away. That was a state requirement that's no longer a requirement to apply. So that was a big win for us. We attend universities all through the state. We've gone down to the southern part of the state, even over to Snow College. We are very active with Salt Lake Community College, the University of Utah, and Weber State locally. And we also have open houses held at the Public Safety Building and attend hiring fairs across the state throughout the year. One of the most effective ways that we've found to recruit diversity into the police department is through our Explorer program. Our Explorer post is anywhere between 40 to 60 youth, age 14 to 20. Those are youth that are members of our community. They donate their time. They participate in this program 4 hours a week, every week, for the whole time that they're an active member, and they donate service hours. They participate in community events with us, and they're really just an awesome bunch of youth that we get to work with regularly. Is anyone in the group familiar with the Explorers, the Police Explorers?
Commissioner,
Steve, of course. Yeah.
I'm not seeing anybody else.
I'm not.
No.
Well, if you have a chance, we're conducting our meetings virtually right now, but it would be awesome for you guys to see this group in action, and I invite you to participate in the meetings, maybe even address the youth and ask them for their input. The majority of them are female, actually. A lot of them are speak multiple languages. The majority of them are minority, and we just love them to death. We have 6 in the process for the next new hire class right now who are former or are current Explorers. And they may meet every Tuesday from 4 to 8 p.m. And then we do regular visits with the high schools in Salt Lake City as well. Do you have any questions as far as that goes right now?
I do.
Yes, ma'am. You're fine.
You went over who you have working with you. I want to know what stipulations that you're looking for when you are recruiting. Do you look to see what their previous past record is if you're hiring an officer? What's your range for people of color coming on the police force in Utah? Probably a bunch of other questions, but we'll just leave it at those 2. And if anybody else has, I'm sorry, I have so many questions.
You are completely fine. And we talk about this a lot. So the minimum qualifications according to state law are that the applicant have a high school diploma or GED and be a U.S. citizen. The U.S. citizen part is a state law. In a couple other states in the United States allow legal permanent residents to be police officers. So for instance, someone who is a refugee or an immigrant who is now a legal permanent resident can apply to be a police officer in those other states. In Utah, you must be a full-fledged U.S. citizen in order to apply to be a police officer. Our Human Resources Department manages the application process. So it's an online application through the SLC Gov website, just like every other job in the city, including internships. And they just need to fill that out and make sure that they have a copy of their high school diploma or GED and can prove that they're a U.S. citizen. And that's all that's required on the very front end of the application process. Every couple times a year, we take everybody who's in that pool who's applied and meets the minimum qualifications to participate in a PT test or physical training test, and then they'll go into an initial written test. So they show up, they get invited. We run it several weekends in a row for about a whole month, and you can sign up to come in the morning or afternoon. I think we did one in like a weekday evening. We try to be really flexible and give a broad range of times available. If you pass the PT test and the written test, then you are invited to go on to the first like set of interviews. And this is the first time that an applicant would sit in front of a board, and they are asked behavioral based questions that are standardized across everyone who interviews. If they pass the interview portion, then they go into the background check process, and they're given a CVSA, which is like a lie detector test. And if they pass that, then they're invited to do a psychological test and evaluation and do an interview with the chief. If they pass that, then they move on to the medical exam and drug screening, and then they submit an application to post so that the state peace officer can look at their application and then determine whether they can be a police officer. And then they move on to the academy. So it's a really long process.
Yeah, Chief just popped onto the screen, turned his camera on, which leads me to believe he wanted to interject. And I think,
look, Chrissy, you're doing a great job. I just want to touch on a couple things she mentioned, and they're very important because Salt Lake City has taken a different perspective on some of these things. When it's kind of sad that if your immigration status, if you have an LPR, you can serve in the military, you can fight for your country, you can die for your country, but you can't be a police officer. And so we are looking at ways to change that law, but it is state law. You can be a firefighter, but you can't be a police officer. And so we're working with David Litvak and some of the legislators up on the Hill to see if we can't change that, because it seems very restricted. What's that?
This session currently, you're looking at that?
Yeah, we are. And the other thing is, one thing that we've done within our process is the written test. There's a written test that's given by post. Everybody has to take it, a competency test. And we used to grade it on the better you did, the more weight you got in the process. And what we were finding is that young candidates that English wasn't their first language, read the questions over and over to make sure they understood them, and they would run out of time, and so they would get poor scores. And so we said, look, we're not going to weight that anymore. If you can pass it, and Christy, I believe we put it down to 80%. It's a pass-fail. If you can pass it,
yes,
good.
it is.
Yeah, we'll go from there. We don't.
And
go ahead, Christy.
The PT test is also pass-fail. It's not weighted, how well you do it. You either passed or you didn't, and it's really not hard to pass.
And then Salt Lake City we do a very extensive background on office. We on the individuals we hire, because we want good people. But at times we have lateral officers that will apply to come and work here. And we do an extensive background on our lateral officers because we don't want somebody else's problems. There are some, officers will jump ship if they're, if they're under investigation or they've got discipline pending, and they'll go to another one. We don't want that. We do a very extensive background to make sure we're not picking up problem officers from other agencies. So I just wanted to kind of expand on those three things. Thanks, Christy.
No problem.
Can I ask the question? And this may have been provided already, and I just have to find it. Will we provide a copy of the application that officers are given when they apply?
I don't know that I don't know if you were provided one, but we can definitely get you one. I have a couple other things I can send to you, like the post minimum qualifications and a graphic that shows the timeline, because the timeline for, from the moment we invite people to a PT test until they are full-fledged sworn police officers who can operate competently on their own is about 15 to 18 months, depending on the time frame. So it is not a swift process.
Yeah, Christy, if you could send those to Coletta, then she can distribute to the group here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Another question is, so when they go through the training, is the training paid training? Or the academy, is that
yes,
paid?
So we actually, as the Salt Lake City Police Department, has the only other post-certified academy outside of the state academy. We do that so that we can sort of control our own destiny. It's our own teachers, it's our own policy. We add extra things in. It's a little bit longer than the state post academy. And they are an employee of the police department when they start the academy.
Okay. And the wage, what's the wage for that? And the reason why I'm asking this question, because if somebody say, okay, this is what I want to do, and it's a good candidate, but they can't afford to leave their current job in order to go through the training in the academy. That's the only reason why I'm asking.
I think the last time I checked, and Chief may correct me on this, it was roughly $21 an hour.
Okay.
Commissioner McDonald, yeah, it's 22, 23, right in that ballpark. But one thing that Salt Lake City does a little different than other agencies, if we hire you, the minute you sit in our academy, day one, we're paying you. You're an employee and we pay you. A lot of agencies will expect you to go through post on your own dime and your own time to get that certification. But in Salt Lake City, if we hire you, we're paying you from day one.
Yeah, and to the Chief's point, the state post, it's like going to college. You pay for it yourself, and then you try to find a job at a police department after the fact.
Excellent. Great information, great questions, answers. I just want to ask, just being cognizant of the time, I mean, I'd go for hours, but want to be respectful of the time. Any final questions for Christy or Chief related to this?
Christy, are the behavioral questions law enforcement based, or are they more broad, so someone without experience could also answer?
They definitely, I've actually sat on the board. I've volunteered to be one of those board members, and they are very typical interview questions. You do not have to have a strong understanding of law enforcement to answer them, but they are very behavior based. So we're really looking at how is somebody going to react to a situation.
Josh, it's Andrew Riggle with the Disability Law Center. I was wondering if members of the commission are interested, if it might be possible to get copies of the written questions and the interview questions if they're available at all.
Thank you for that, Mr. Riggle. I don't know if you can have those, but I will definitely ask. And I'm sure you can get the questions that were asked in the interview. I'm just not sure about the written test.
I
can get back.
Okay, you'll get back to us.
Yes.
Commissioner Shiflett.
I don't know if this is a question for you or we talk about after. I want to know if there's any cultural sensitivity training, as a part of this training, and if the people who are doing recruitment do any cultural sensitivity training, and the people who are doing any of the training, or is that not included?
Let me narrow that in, since the subcommittee on training might be more relevant, but I see where your question is relevant to recruiters, and you're asking to Christy, like, what kind of training do they have in this regard?
We never know who's coming in with their own biases. That's why I'm asking.
Right.
Thank you.
There is, so we require everyone, and we just did the entire police department over the last 3 years, to take the fair and impartial policing and do another course called Blue Courage and the Arbinger course. So those were big pushes with the department to get everybody who was in the department at that time to get trained on those. And there's also city training that is specifically for cultural sensitivity. Those are ongoing. So we continue to put people through trainings like that.
Is there anything specific related to that cultural sensitivity for recruiters or those doing, making those efforts you identified at the beginning of your presentation, Christy, with going out and going to universities and communities?
And not specifically just for the groups, the group of people who are recruiters, but they did take all the other training that was required. And we look for a very diverse population of officers to be part of the recruiting outreach team, for the specific reason that they can go into their own communities and talk to them about being a police officer and in the importance of being represented in law enforcement.
All right, great. Well, we thank you for your time, SLCPD. I'm sure we'll ask you again in the not too distant future after we have time to review and digest and think about this and move forward. So you're more than welcome to stay on. Let me ask the commission, do you have any final questions or comments before we let our guests leave? No? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Again, you're welcome to stay on, but don't want to make you. So, all right.
Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
All right. So you guys as a subcommittee, give me your quick breakdown, your where you are, how you'd like to move forward. What are your thoughts? Was this helpful? Does it I guess, what's your reaction? Darlene smiling and
Yeah, you see Darlene. I'm gonna let Darlene talk before I talk. Go, Darlene.
wondering if you should speak first, right?
Please, Darlene.
I because I missed last week and I'm playing catch up a bit. There's a lot more that I have to look over and read over before I really dive in. I do know that there was an issue that was brought up to me with people regarding the application process and how that application process, inadvertently or not, just kind of weed out or get rid of more diversity within the department by the way certain questions are asked.
Okay, so that's why you asked for a copy, and so that'll be helpful for you to review and assess and make some determinations, and based on that, there might be something we scope to make some recommendations on that specifically. Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner McDonald.
Yeah, and I'd like to, oh, Carol, I'm so sorry.
No, please go, Steve. Go. Go.
I was pleased with what the chief said about that in-post test. That is a requirement to be able to attend post. You have to pass at a certain level. A lot of agencies use that as a differentiator, and it's a standard achievement test that is, in my opinion, is the best scores come from people who did best in school. So we can talk about other institutional racism in other institutions that could cross over into law enforcement. So I was thrilled that they use that as a qualifier, which it has to be, because if you can't pass it, you can't go to post, but rather than a differentiator. And then and I also wanted to ask that question. So thinking along the same lines here as Darlene, if the questions are already to test whether you have a good understanding of law enforcement and its practices, then that can be a gatekeeper for people who are only familiar with law enforcement. And as a mostly white institution, that could like reinforce itself, right? So I was pleased to hear, at least on the surface, no. I don't have any reason to doubt that, but I would also like to see some examples of those, and examine for bias and continue to drill down in that same area that you brought up. So I had those same concerns.
Yeah, me too. I was glad you asked the questions about seeing these tests, because just because you have them doesn't mean that they are meeting the needs. Because you're talking about recruiting young people, and there's nothing wrong with recruiting young people, but they're young. I'm just going to say that, without a lot of experience. So.
Have we asked a question regarding previous drug testing, drug offenses? Say, even if someone admitted that they've smoked marijuana. Now, in some states, marijuana is legal. If that can be, do we know if that's a disqualifier for Salt Lake City Police Department if they admitted to smoking marijuana within the past year or so? And if not, is that something we can find out as well?
Steve?
I'm sorry, Josh. Corollary to that is post. If you can't go to post, you can't be a police officer. You have to be certified, right? And I know that they do have time periods. So if you used certain illegal drugs within certain periods of time, you could not attend the academy. I'm thinking marijuana is 2 years and harder drugs are 5 years, but I think maybe we should research and ask that question of post. And what Ms. Judd was saying, she said after you go through that process with Salt Lake PD, you apply at post and you have to qualify there. So there are convictions of certain crimes and certain timeframes in addition to drugs. So there'll be a whole level of information that might be worth understanding the limitations.
Steve, can you articulate the ask? What would the question be for that information, the data?
It might be on the website, but just the qualifications or disqualifiers to go to police officer standards and training.
Okay, thank you. And Sherry Whitworth, I apologize for not introducing you or referencing you. I assumed you were with the police department and now you've hung on the call. And so I just wanted to have you introduce yourself and welcome you onto our meeting.
Yeah, I apologize. I jumped on late, so I probably missed introductions, but I am with the CIT Utah board as well as the Disability Law Center.
All right, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And staying late, everyone's staying late, but I want to try and narrow down into, so this is great discussion and I think critical for us to move forward. And so what else is on your mind?
The only thing on my mind is if we can get a copy of everything that they said they do, I think that would be really great. I mean, I really want to see this testing for cultural consideration, cultural sensitivity. So I think thanks for asking for those forms, Ms. Darlene, Commissioner Darlene.
Okay, awesome. Where's your head with use of force? It's so complicated, and Steve, it's good to have you on the call because you obviously have lived the application of that. Darlene McDonald, go ahead.
I had to slip away. I had my doorbell when you guys were speaking about that, and I had taken notes, and I was going to jump in, and then somebody was at the stupid door. I have issues with this piece, mostly because, okay, as I was listening, what was jumping out at me as I was listening were too many cases where we hear shoot first, ask questions later. And that is what kept popping up in my head as they were speaking, shoot first, ask questions later. when you don't, when you roll up on someone, and Tamir Rice comes to mind, and I understand Tamir Rice, Cleveland, Ohio, not Salt Lake City. However, when you're getting information from a dispatcher and someone's saying, I don't believe the gun is real, but this is what's happening, and the officer rolls up, gets out, boom, bang, what the phrase that we hear time and time again is, if the officer fears for his life, and that's the only phrase they have to use, if there's reasonable fear for their life, it's justified. And I'm glad Steve is here because he can speak to this. And that's what kept jumping out, just kept popping into my mind as I was listening to them, and I didn't get a chance to speak to it when they were on the call. But that's what I really want to just address mostly, because we do want to keep everyone safe. If there are guns, toy guns, that are being made to look real. I get that. I mean, there was a reason why I wouldn't buy my kids water guns when they were kids. No, my kids didn't have water guns because I feared that very thing. That I didn't want a police officer to mistaken a water gun for a real gun. So I didn't buy any. And that's probably why they think they didn't have a good childhood. But anyway.
I agree, Darlene.
Yeah, blame it on that, Darlene.
But, you know, but reasonable fear for your life and mistaking a toy gun for a real gun when you just don't know. And then say, well, it turned out to be an airsoft gun, as you said. That phrase just kept popping up in my head.
Yeah, and Commissioner Shiflett, go ahead, and then I'll follow up with a question.
Well, I agree with Darlene. It's that fear. The law enforcement's afraid, and the community members afraid, but they have the power. You know, they have the gun. They have the authority to say, I feared for my life. And in that case of Tamir Rice, it was, again, a young officer. So we have to remember those things. So, okay, I'm sorry.
No, you never need to apologize for talking. Arlene, you brought up in the meeting and then just now the information an officer has going into it and the dispatch, right? And they didn't really address that, but I was curious to ask Steve about that, about policies around the communication, the information you get as an officer to go respond to an incident, and from your position, what that looks like and what you're asked to do as an officer and what it's like walking into it, and while trying to balance this reasonableness standard.
Yeah, trying to take some notes here to gather my own thoughts. So I'll just tell you all that I'm my two other subcommittee assignments are training and school safety. And training, an area that we're looking to drill down into is how the dispatchers are trained. How do they get the information, and do they have enough understanding themselves about to get the right information, then also issues with disabilities, issues with cultural, like Carol, I think you mentioned previously in a full meeting that when your neighborhood, when you call the police, you have to tell them that Black folks live at that house, right? And that's the question is, would the dispatcher pass that along? Would they see that as important information to give to the officers? So we are drilling down into that area to see how they're trained. And with that said, the dispatchers try to take information and they try to convey information, and there's a lot lost in translation. There's a lot lost in playing the telephone game of you told me something, right? So we try to get the simplest information and get it dispatched. We try to ensure that the dispatchers are trained to ask relevant questions and get the information out. I know that Salt Lake previously had a dispatch system. If this is too detailed, flag me, but previously had a dispatch system where it was all scripted. And by the time the caller got to some of the most critical information, it was already a dynamic situation with police officers arriving, right? So get the right information up front and then get it to the officers. Darlene, I think a lot, Mr. Darlene, I think a lot about how to write a policy or a law to draw the line on use of force, because what you're coming down to is asking somebody to bet their life on what they're seeing, potentially, right? And I'm not sure how to articulate that into words if the gun looks 90% like a real gun or something like that. So I don't have an answer to that, and I want to be careful because we also want to protect our community. We also want to create an environment where officers can do their job safely. And not only that, but if we have the standards so high, I ask myself, who would do it anymore, right? If so many of those protections were taken away, who would still do it? So I think that balance is critical. I'm not, I don't know that we have a good balance, but anyway, that's something that's really important to look at. And then one other thought is some of the things that the chief said today about those policies and the philosophy of the department are really good, and they're really important. And I'll just restate what I heard, and that is, rather than rushing into a situation that could then go dynamic and then require the use of force, they want to look more at taking their time, having the right officers on scene, having a plan. And I can see incidents that I've been involved with in the past, both personally and through training study, where if officers had taken more time, or if they better communicated what they were supposed to do rather than rushing up into a situation, perhaps it could have avoided serious negative outcomes. So those areas that he's talking about start to reduce the importance of whether that's a real gun or not, because we have time and we have distance and we have resources and we have cover, and then it's less urgent to make that split-second decision. So those are some of the things that I'm hearing from them that I think we can apply to our policy recommendations to help make it so it's not such an instantaneous decision. And I'll just say, ideally, if there is implicit bias, if there is racial bias, then that person of color just gets a second look before that action is taken, right? So all of those things I think could help specifically on our commission and also for law enforcement in general.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's interesting. I caught that as well, and I caught it in the executive order where states officers must always use de-escalation techniques before using force. And so be interesting, look at the policies and where I think he mentioned a few of them, like you just articulated, Steve, but also the duty to intercede, he mentioned, right? And so, yeah, consider, what they're doing there to prevent that getting in that position of having to use force. And is it enough? And how's it being applied, right?
There's another component to that part as well. A lot of conversations that I've heard from youth has been, yes, for example, knee on the neck was banned. There are plenty of cases in states where it was banned, but it still happened. So what are the consequences when those rules or laws are not followed? Do the police or whoever conducts those kind of acts, are they treated differently? It's like, are they treated just by the homicide part of it, or is it also the violation of laws?
Yeah, that's a great question, and maybe we can seek more on that. My understanding is that if it's not a violation of law, it certainly would be or could be a violation of policy. And what I hear in the executive order, the outcome of that and what they're trying to do is, okay, clearly if it's not a violation of the law, it's going to be a violation of the policy on many levels. One, use of force, they're rewriting of that. Then 300 dash or .2.1, duty to intercede, obviously, right? And there are repercussions there. Use of force to effect an arrest, deadly force. So it sounds like they're trying to put in policies that, like Mr. Cottrell said, go beyond the requirements in case law. Is that your understanding, Steve?
Yeah, like I tried to articulate before, some areas they've raised the floor, right? So that won't change legal investigation or the criminal investigation, but it can change the way the department can enforce those policies. And just as a philosophical matter for this commission, I think that's really important for us to look at. That if the department can hold the person accountable, that still means that they may be terminated and may not be in law enforcement anymore, even though that the criminal justice system didn't deliver that justice. At the very least, it's within our ability to make recommendations about policy that can affect the employees that they have, which can improve the policing in our community, right? And then just one other thought, I know that the city attorney's office has already done a presentation on the different ways officer-involved critical incidents are investigated, from the criminal to the civil to the policy, so it's the internal investigation. But it was pretty early on in our commission work, and I don't know how widely that was understood or how deeply that penetrated. We may want to revisit that, because that's a really clear way of showing the three different ways. And what we have the most control of is, again, policy.
All right, would that be of interest or benefit to the group? Does anyone remember that presentation? Or
it won't hurt my feelings if you don't want it. I just think it's a value. I've heard the question asked a few times subsequent to that, and so I think it might be a good review.
Were there slides to that or a presentation provided, Steve?
Yeah, city attorney, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember her name. Is it Katie? Is that right, David? Yeah, I gave an overview and then provided a document on how that's looked at. I think it's worth revisiting.
All right, we can put that in the minutes and attachment to the meeting notes. Andrew, and then I wanted to get a couple thoughts on our listening sessions and have a couple questions for you guys on that.
Steve might have been starting to address this already, and so feel free to disregard if you're already headed down this path. But I was just trying to remember if you've had a discussion or been given any information about what the sanctions are for officers who have been found to violate policy, and how often violate, and if there's any data on how often violations are alleged, and the outcome of those investigations and any repercussions from them.
Yeah, that's a great, yeah, thanks, Andrew. That's, the first part is anywhere from a verbal to written warning up through termination, and that can include demotion, time off without pay, cumulative violations can affect your overall pay. So there's a wide range on that, and I do think we should have internal affairs come in and have a conversation. Then they can probably provide some of those statistics you were talking about. How many complaints are filed, how many are upheld, and what are the consequences of those. They should have that all in a matrix.
Does that answer your question, Andrew? All right, so we'll capture that in the notes and the requested information. I wanted to ask you subcommittee members as we move forward in planning the listening sessions with the broader community that we'll be doing. Wanted to ask you what you want to learn from those listening sessions from the community, and who do you want to hear from? So what do you want to, what are the right questions to ask the community? What communities do you want to hear from? What are your thoughts?
The people we want to hear from out in our community, is that the question?
Yeah, so as we're organizing these community listening sessions and getting the word out and creating that structure to have those listening sessions, what communities should we engage?
I think that we should put a call out for people who were involved with the protest this past summer. I mean, who physically went down there and protested, and get their thoughts on the commission. What do they have any optimism about it? Pessimistic about it? What are their thoughts about it? And what would they like to see? I think the call should go directly to them.
Okay, so any other thoughts?
I think that was a good idea that Darlene just pointed out. I'd like to hear from those people.
Hey, Darlene, when you say protesters, can you define what a protester might?
Yeah, they look like me. I was down there. When I went, in all seriousness, when I was there, I mean, it was, the traffic had literally blocked. Coming off the freeway, it was, they eventually had to block off streets. There were hundreds and thousands of people down there. This is before everything went off the rails. Those people, something that was awakened in them enough that at first when the call went out that we're going to have a protest in Salt Lake City, we thought literally, and I'm not exaggerating this at all, we thought maybe 5 people would come. It was a traffic jam.
Yeah.
It was a traffic jam in Salt Lake City. Invite the people that thought enough to get into their cars, because it was a caravan protest because of, COVID. It was a caravan protest. 4 or 5 people were in a car with Black Lives Matter signs in downtown Salt Lake City.
Yeah,
so
they came out of the woodwork. Where'd they come from? What awoke you? What got you going?
Yeah. What got you here? What woke up inside of you? And not just young kids, I mean suburban white moms, right? Were down there. People
talking about my wife, Darlene.
Yeah. We're there. What got you there? So these are the people I would like to hear from and ask them what got you there, and what would you like to see from this commission? I want to talk to them, and even talk to the artists, some of the artists that have put up murals. What's happening inside of them that they're able to create such these murals around this painful thing? Do they have any thoughts on what we're doing here and what can be done to make things better? Even reach out to them too.
I don't want to cut you off, Darlene, because you're rolling. Good info. All right, other thoughts? Andrew, from your position, any groups, community members, and what you'd like to hear?
Sorry, Josh, you woke me up.
I just didn't want to leave you
I think from out from our perspective, and we can try to help with this a little bit. But I think in our community groups that we see most often are obviously folks with significant mental illness, and so we need folks with lived experience to be able to share their experiences with law enforcement, whether good or bad. And then we will also hear often hear from folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, and so communication with law enforcement in an already tense situation can be even more challenging. So I think it would be helpful to hear that perspective. And then folks with intellectual disabilities or traumatic brain injuries and their experiences interacting with law enforcement as well.
All right, thank you, Andrew. So moving forward, I want to thank Kira for taking notes and being engaged on the call, and David being present as well. When Kira and I will finalize the notes and get them back to you soon with action items and requests and summary of these questions and asks. You can respond to those before our commission meeting on Wednesday. We're going to give a subcommittee report, and each subcommittee will and talk about the listening sessions in more depth. So, but thank you, Kira, for taking notes today and staying late. Thank you, everybody, for staying late. I was worried that who we had lined up for the meeting and the questions I knew you would have that it would go over an hour. I was mostly worried about Commissioner Shiflett getting upset at me, but she had a lot of questions, so it's her fault.
I'm not going to get upset with you. Sometimes I just have another meeting to go to. Today I do not. So I'm just sitting here. I do have a lot of questions because that's what I do. I come up with questions. So
well, as we move forward, I know there's stuff to read and you have jobs to do, but we're going to implement some other additional easy ways to communicate as we move forward while we're not in this hour setting, as we narrow and hone in on some things, some polling or emailing or some other communication methods that are simple. But thanks for dedicating your time and giving your input. Luna, please.
I just probably should have spoken a little earlier, but in terms of categories for listening sessions, one of the ones that I would like to explore is recent refugees, and especially the non-English speaker, not just refugees, non-English speakers, to see what kind of barriers do they have understanding the policing in America, in our state and county, and if there's any education that's available to them, how do they cope?
Yeah, great point. Excellent.
And Josh, it's not a disability one, so I might get fired for it. I don't know, but but we'll see. Luna's comment just reminded me, and I'm not sure if we can do this or how you could do this, given the fear that might be in the community. But any undocumented folks that might be willing to provide feedback anonymously, even in a different form or setting than a public venue like this, because I think their experiences and concerns are going to be of a different variety than a lot of things that you're going to hear otherwise.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for bringing up the context, because we are looking at different contexts to hold these meetings, public and open, specific, targeted, invited groups, and so there are sensitivities, right, that people might not feel comfortable sharing candidly and openly in a public forum, and so we want to provide safe spaces and ensure that we have broad outreach across the valley and across a cross section of the community. And as Commissioner McDonald said, all those people that came out of the woodwork or wherever they came from, we want to engage, not just those that are often heard. So thank you. These are great recommendations. And so if any other thoughts come up, feel free to email, or we'll talk more about it on Wednesday's call. All right. Anything else? All right.
Not for tonight.
Yeah, not for tonight. Okay. Anything, David, from your end? All right. Have a good night, everybody. Sleep well.
Thanks, Josh.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for letting me sit in.
Thank you.